Hey everyone, welcome back. This is the Manny Bernabe Show, and I am your host, Manny Bernabe, where we talk about AI, digital transformation, IoT. And today I am very excited because I have a very special guest, John Rossman, who is a former Amazon executive, and he's also the author of two books that I really like quite a bit: the Amazon Way on IoT, and also the Amazon Way, Amazon's 14 leadership principles. And if you can look in here, all of these are really well notated and tagged up. So I am really excited to have John here on the show today. We're going to talk about digital transformation, what Amazon gets right, how can companies replicate or try to pull some of that into their own strategy. So thank you, John, for joining us. Why don't you say hi to everybody?
Manny, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the talk, and I hope everybody enjoys it.
Awesome. Hey, John, I was wondering if we can start our conversation with talking about Amazon's customer obsession. And when I think about companies that do a lot for their customers, that put their customers front and center, I always think of Amazon. Examples like previewing your book online. Publishers didn't want that, but Amazon pushed forward with that. Reviews, publishers didn't want that either, but Amazon says, hey, our customers are going to love this, we have to do this for our customers. Where does that come from? How is that practice at Amazon, and how are other companies trying to do that too?
Well, that's those three big questions there all lumped together and everything. So, there's 16 leadership principles at Amazon. The first and the most famous is customer obsession, and it reads: leaders start with the customer and work backwards. They work vigorously to earn and keep customer trust. And while they pay attention to competitors, they obsess about customers. To me, the most interesting word in that principle is the word obsession. We could have chosen an easier word, a more comfortable word, but obsession means like you are all in about this, right? Like there's no ambiguity about what your priorities are when you are obsessed about something. And Amazon meant it as to really give themselves the expectation and the excuse to pursue doing really hard things, sometimes small things, sometimes really big things, in order to create a better customer experience. And but it is just one of 16 leadership principles. That's the other thing to note is you can't have just customer obsession. And relative to these principles, you have to use the right couple of principles at the right moment. I've run into situations where somebody will go, well, yeah, that's not customer obsessed or whatever. It's like, yeah, but there's a different perspective or a different set of principles to be applied in this circumstance and stuff. And yeah, you asked where Amazon got it from. I think this really did come from the genesis of Amazon, which means it came from the genesis of Jeff Bezos, that he always intended Amazon to be the world's most customer-centric company ever. A lot of these other more operational principles were more developed over time, but that one was really from the genesis. And I really think it just comes from, at the end of the day, if you put yourself in the perspective of the customer, what's the real outcome or objective they have? And how do you reduce friction and make it easier and easier and easier for them to get to the outcome that they are looking for? And I think it's such a powerful principle. Amazon always talks about start with the customer and work backwards. It's really about start with the end experience that you want, the end outcome that you want, and work backwards, versus working from a constrained mindset of what our current state is into, how you improve that. They sound similar, but they typically lead to very different ideas and concepts about what's possible.
Yeah, and I think that really resonates with me as an AI and machine learning practitioner because oftentimes data scientists want to start with the data and start with the model and the technology and then think about what we can create for the end user. But as I've matured in my career and in my practice, I've always found it to be much more useful to start with the customer needs first and work backwards and say, hey, provided that these are the jobs and the pain points that the customer has, now let's think about what technology we have, what data we have, and what we can build to make those folks happy. That has been a much more helpful framework for me.
I think in most cases, it's not that you can't ever say, like, hey, what new problem, what might we, or insight might we discover from a data set that we hadn't explored before and everything. That does happen, but not as often, right? I think it typically is like identify a problem, an end state, an experience, the work to be done, however you want to express it, which is about like, what do you envision the future being, and then try to work backwards, first in an unconstrained manner, like what could we, possibly be the absolute unconstrained, and then apply constraints relative to that. I think that tends to be a more powerful, and you not only end up in different places, but you tend to not get bogged down in as many kind of as is problems. And what happens when people start talking about the as is situation, it becomes a form of complaining. And you can take just some of that, but over time that starts to just sap the energy out of a team or out of a situation. It becomes defeatist in mindset, and I think it sets kind of a bad energy tone for the overall search situation versus like, hey, here's our summit, here's what we're working for, and then trying to find the best path to that summit and everything.
I really like that because when you're working, at least in my space, I'm working on AI, machine learning implementation. You have a lot of different players in the room. You have a product owner, you have a marketing person, you have a data scientist, you have a data person, and they all have their different agendas or they have their different views of what's going on. But it's nice to have this North Star and saying, hey, if we were to just do everything from scratch and build something perfect for our end customer, then here's what we're targeting. Here's like what we would aim for in a perfect way. And let's all aim towards that direction. And from my perspective, too, as a data scientist, it also helps me limit the amount of excess complexity that I have in my problem. So, this is a big problem for data science and machine learning where we want to come out of the gate and do deep learning neural net. But sometimes the customer just wants a simple graph or a simple model or a simple statistics. And if you start with the end in mind, that helps you identify that bare minimum high value thing and deliver that and get that to the customer and make them happy.
Yeah, I think that North Star metaphor is a very good one. I write a weekly newsletter called the Digital Leader Newsletter. You can find it on Substack. Um, and one of the topics I talk a lot about is about digital transformation. And I wrote one episode about, essentially the buzzword bonanza, I called it, of digital transformation. I think that digital transformation is an interesting category of like, how do you roll up everything that's going on under this name of digital transformation? But it's a horrible term to actually operate against or to build a strategy against. So I think the start really becomes in creating taxonomy that starts with, at its highest level, improving customer experiences, employee experiences, existing operational excellence, and then new innovative products and services, and then new business models. And so if that's your top level taxonomy, and then from there you click into exacting um, articulation of what, the superpower or the real feature that you're trying to give your end user. And I always talk about trying to make it so that you can feel it, you can touch it, you can feel that power that you're giving them. a lot of companies start off with these kind of obscure or vague notions of what the problem is that they want to solve, or what the powers you want to give the user or the customer. And the better you can articulate, I want a real time insight into X, or the ability to provision with no assistance on a real time basis, something like that. Like, oh, those are very exacting and narrow feature of what that use case needs to be. Amazon has a technique called the future press release, and it's an envisioning technique that helps you do this, which is about articulating what the future is and then working back from it. I read about that in a couple of my books and in the newsletter. And it's a really powerful exercise at the start, before you're prototyping, before you're building anything, of trying to write. I usually write a series of press releases, and like, hey, is it like this, or is it like this, or is it like this? And especially when you have a team and you're trying to bring others along and get the best out of them, of their thinking, exploring the exactitude of what the features might be, the superpowers that we give to somebody, can be really, really powerful, and just accelerates you through so many different types of problems that you'll face along the way.
Yes, I really like that technique. It's the future press release technique. And the exercise there is get your team in the room and envisioning that you're announcing your new product and service to the world on the cover of the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg. And what's the first two paragraphs that you're going to say for that customer that's gonna have them be interested in your product.
And as part of those paragraphs, what is the exact reason or reasons why you're going to beat whatever the existing status quo is, right? And not being vague about, like, oh, it's a better customer experience, or it's cheaper, or it's faster. No, what is the specific customer experience? How much cheaper are you? How much faster are you? And being exact in those notions.
And you mentioned something earlier that I don't want to overlook, that I kind of want to go back to, but this idea of framing everything in terms of three buckets for your products and your services: A, improving the customer experience; B, improving operational excellence; C, developing new business models. I really like that. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because again, as a technical person that's implementing solution, it's sometimes very easy to get lost in all the minutia and all the tech, and we have to remember that, hey, we're here to increase overall business value. And those three buckets are pretty much what you need to focus on. And all of your work needs to map to one of those three buckets in order for you to deliver value to your customer and to get your team on board. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that framework.
Yeah, so I call that framework the triple threat framework, and it's a basketball reference. And basically, from a position, a player can either dribble, pass, or shoot the ball. So it gives you the most optionality, and it forces the defense to cover you with the least knowledge of what you might be doing going forward. And the observation was that, especially in the Internet of Things, is that an idea can serve, oftentimes, both the basis for improving a customer experience, and uh, provide a basis for improving an operational situation, and it can prove as the basis for a future business model.
Hmm.
So, for example, think about maybe a tank or something like that, and you decide to put in a sensorized, connected device that measures, pressure, temperature, suitability of that tank to service. Well, A, that can really improve the customer experience. B, that could improve your operations. Like, are you delivering product with quality? Is it have sustained capability? And then C, you could envision an as a service business model where, instead of delivering an item or a tank, you're actually delivering what the end product is, pressurized air, pressurized gas, whatever it is in this example. And so these examples, especially when you're talking about the Internet of Things scenarios, they tend to kind of be connected. And while it's important to definitely think about like what's the specific user problem that we're delivering to and everything, keep your eyes open for how you can leverage the same capability for other purposes.
Yeah, absolutely. For a lot of my clients, I'm helping them leverage connected devices, IoT data, so that they can predict when things are going to fail. And I feel like the customer experience definitely improves because we're anticipating when things are going to fail before they happen, so we can avoid downtime and the improving operational excellence as well. We check that box because then engineers can look at the product, how it's working out in the wild, and do recalls sooner, or can make their next product version better. And I feel like those buckets pay the upfront costs, but a lot of the alpha comes from the third bucket that you mentioned, which was new business models. When you're able to sell software services on top of your hardware, that's much higher margin business, and it can really change your game, not only in terms of having software revenue now on your income statement, but also in terms of being a little bit closer to your client and your customer, knowing them better. And to the extent that you're able to do that, you're going to be able to get more information and do even more of that moving forward. It's a
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
a it's a really triple threat.
it really is the path of becoming a more strategic partner versus a vendor for your end customer. And so when you are providing a service that more and more you're accountable for, while there's some accountability that goes with that by definition, it also starts creating you as more of a partner in their eyes and actually in their operating model, versus less of a vendor. And so I think that's super important. Manny, do you find also that um, if you were to leverage kind of this extensibility, like this is an extensibility mindset that we're talking about, that if you have just a project mindset to something like, hey, we're going to launch it, we launch and leave, what you need to do is transition to a bit more of a product ownership mindset where teams like, okay, this is going to be the first iteration or release, but we're not just dispersing the project team after that because we have to explore what the future opportunities could be. Do you see your clients kind of thinking through like, oh, how do we transition from projects to product mindset?
Totally. It's a major change, not only in terms of the personnel, the way of thinking, but also the accounting systems. Like how do you account for now having to invest in connectivity, new data analytics that's going to benefit a whole bunch of different types of product lines. It's a new way of thinking for a lot of my customers. I think that the customers that are doing this well appreciate and understand that the relationship with their customer is going to be enhanced by data streams and productivity, and this is going to be the future of their relationship with those customers. And yes, we're still going to be hardware providers, but a big chunk of what we're going to be offering is going to be software and services, and that's going to be good for us. And that's going to be where we're going, and B, it's going to be a little bit of a change from where we are right now, but that's okay because we know that it's going to be worth it. And the example that I like to talk about out in terms of IoT and Industry 4.0 is Tesla. Tesla right now sells electric vehicles, but if you look at the most recent earnings release, they talked about how they're going to do full self-driving services for their cars. They're going to push that over the air, and now a good chunk of their fleet is going to have that capability. Now people are going to pay for that. That's a new service for them. They are providing insurance now, so they're selling insurance to their customers, and they're basing the premiums off of the driver activity. So they know exactly who's driving and how reckless they are, even
So,
if they're an 18-year-old, 18-year-old in like a particular zip code who would typically get a super huge premium. If they can see how this driver is really performing and that they actually drive very carefully and very cautiously, they can better price that premium better than almost any insurance company out there. So to me, those are examples of how you can leverage this technology, IoT, this mindset, and build towards that services based type of revenue stream.
yeah, and I think it also points out like when I think about this obscure term of digital transformation, you really have to think through all the factors of what it takes in order to transform. So we've primarily talked about you need to define future state capabilities versus kind of wallowing in the problem, and you have to break it down according to a taxonomy into finer use cases. The other things that you need to address are you need to address leadership, and part of leadership is how do we adjust our organizational model, and to some degree, as you mentioned, your accounting relative to create this product mindset, and how do we have experimentation and the right types of patients for the right types of situations. And then, the other factors you got to think through is kind of the what's your agile process for taking in ideas, scanning the future horizon, deciding which ones to proceed on. How do you test? How do you prune? How do you scale? Most companies don't have a literal definition of a process for how they do that, but yet they expect themselves to somehow magically be consistently innovative. And then the last thing is kind of the governance structure and the right types of metrics and business cases at the right point. I oftentimes, talk to my clients about you need to be thoughtful about asking the right questions at the right time, because what typically happens is we ask the right questions at the wrong time. So, for example, early on, if you were saying, well, what might the market be or a P&L be for a new service, you are going to collapse that opportunity, and you're going to shy anybody away from it. You don't know what it is yet, right? And so you have to do that probably a little further down the experimentation pipeline once you truly understand, how are we going to win? What does adoption look like? What's initial customer feedback? What's my unit cost going to be? What's operations going to be? And then you can start talking about what a P&L might be. But way too often people play what I call budget roulette way too early. They have an interesting idea, and then somebody from finance shows up and they go, okay, what are you going to commit to next year? Everybody tightens up, and everything, right? Like, well, that's a type of cultural problem that most companies have, because they're using the wrong management science playbook at the wrong moment in time.
In the companies that you've seen that have done that well, that initial leap of faith, so to speak, what's different about them? Why do they get it right? Because I think you're right. So many companies are stuck in the status quo kind of mindset, and it's hard for them to see
I
that.
think the secret is understanding when you're talking about an idea that you understand well. Those are the types of things that we should be pressing harder on. We should have better estimations early. We should understand our path to market earlier and everything, versus an idea where I think it's a good idea, but I'm not really sure. You got to recognize those are called bets, right? A bet is
Hmm.
something where you think it's a good idea, but you can't prove it. And it's at that point you have to create a different path for ideas that you understand well. Like, I'm going to automate, some warehouse facilities, put some automation in. You should be able to understand pretty early what the labor impact's going to be, how the safety is going to improve, how the productivity is going to improve. That's not much of a bet, and everything, right? Versus, hey, I'm going to transition to an as a service business model versus delivering units. That's a bet. You need to proceed on it. And the key is, how do you keep those as small experiments versus a go big mentality? And it's when you go big that the stakes raise up. You need to allow bets to fail, right? By design, it's an experiment. You learn from experiments, and you need to allow for learning of those experiments. So you have to make them affordable. You have to test as cheaply as possible. So you really have to take into your mindset of, like, what is the concepts of hypothesis building and minimally viable product, we mean minimally viable product. Like, what is the most important thing that we need to test with our users, and how do we isolate and build as little as possible in order to test that? Sometimes it's a simple walkthrough, just a chalk, and everything, right? People way over engineer what they actually need to do in order to test ideas out. Creativity, it's amazing the lack of creativity sometimes you see in over engineering those early prototypes.
John, yeah, I think that your commentary about the small baits, I really like that as the determining factor being how well you know the problem. If you know it really, really well, then you should expect to have a better ROI calculation. But if it's a little bit of a newer space, then don't put that unnecessary burden on it. And I think you've written about this in your books, but this idea of having an innovation portfolio where you're making a series of big bets, small bets. Anything else you want to talk about in terms of an innovation portfolio?
Yeah, so the innovation portfolio, X and Y axis, pretty simple portfolio model. On one axis is risk from low to high, and on the x-axis, benefit from low to high, right? And what most companies are good at is that lower left-hand quadrant: lower risk, lower benefit. Those are the types of initiatives where we understand the nature of the problem and the nature of the payback well. And essentially, if we execute well, we know how it's going to proceed. Those we should be more comfortable in proceeding faster and bigger on, right? So those might be the bigger dots on your portfolio. It's the upper right hand quadrant that most of us don't understand what those are well, right? Those are the bets in our portfolio. And the whole concept is, how do you think big but bet small? So you have to make those circles as small as possible in the early experimentation. Just by mapping your projects, the things you're doing according to that XY benefit versus risk aspect, you start to understand like where your spread is. And it's okay if it's all in the left hand quadrant. That just tells you where you're operating. And then be asking, are there some things where we should be testing earlier ideas? We need to keep those small. We need to have a different governance concept around those types of ideas. And so all of anytime you're dealing with a big enough company, there's a portfolio of options that you can evaluate. And I wrote about this in today's the Digital Leader News Stack article. Is the most important decisions that senior leadership makes is resource allocation. Where do I want to place my investments? And you have to look at it as a portfolio, because when you're saying yes to something, you need to be saying no to some other really good ideas. And the game really starts at that point when you are being deliberate about what you're saying yes to and what you're saying no to.
I really like that. As you know, I have a finance background, and there's a portfolio strategy that's called the barbell approach in finance. So the idea is that you have a number of very safe bets, but then you also have a number of very risky bets, thus the barbell. And so I think that's very similar here. Like, yeah, your low risk bets are gonna make your portfolio nice and steady. You're not gonna lose everything, but then when the market rips, you have those high risk investments that are gonna give you the capital appreciation that you need to outpace inflation and to give you the return that you want on your investment. So I really like that, and it makes sense to me as my with my finance kind of lens. I also think that it's helpful to frame it that way because most managers, to your point, are going to be stuck on the lower left hand side of the space. And that's because that's maybe reputationally that's where you're going to take the less risk, and you're not sticking your neck out so much as a manager, and that's okay. But if you think about the technologies that are going to help you stand apart from the competition in the future, that are going to be adding to your economic moat moving forward, it's really in the upper right part of the quadrant that you want to be, you want to see some investments in. So I think that's really good for an executive team to just do a double check for themselves and saying, hey, are we falling into this trap where all of our bets are super safe, and are we not putting enough emphasis on the future and getting those 10x services out that are going to change the game in 5 years?
And that time frame is exactly the right time frame. There's this concept of kind of horizon one, which is kind of my current operating model, my current products and services, a lot of times my current customers. Horizon two is new use cases, new customers, new capabilities. And one of the things that a CEO and a board should be doing is looking at revenue mix. What's the percentage of revenue mix from essentially new revenue, like truly new service, new product, new customer, new use case versus revenue that's aged? And if you don't understand what that is, basically everything you have to assume today that competitive advantage is short and getting shorter.
Yep.
Therefore, you need to be working harder and investing more in creating future competitive advantage. And so you just need to keep an eye. Again, it's a type of portfolio of your revenue mix. And are you building new revenue capabilities? Because if you don't, then the options become much harder and much riskier, right? Then you have to explore M&A activities. It becomes really expensive, and the success of M&As is a pretty mixed success ratios. Or you start seeing declining margins, and you start becoming a commodity and everything. And so that's why it's really important early as possible to start exploring those horizon two and sometimes even horizon three, which tends to feel more like R&D types technologies and scenarios.
Another great factor that the age of revenue. How did you term that again? The word.
Essentially revenue mix of kind of the aged revenue, like how much revenue comes from products and services that have been launched 2 years or older versus revenue that comes from products or services that have been created within the past 2 years. Pharmacy companies do this type of measurement. That's just like the way they operate their portfolio.
I really like that because you can measure that pretty straightforwardly and you can
Right,
track that over
right.
time.
Yep.
That's great. We got a question from the audience here. Peter over on LinkedIn. Great conversation. How do you persuade customers to make those additional small bets who have been successful with just saying low risk, low benefit in the world that is changing faster? Any thoughts there, John?
Customers are kind of your internal stakeholders. I'm wondering on that question. I think it's just debating what those are, right? And so taking enough time up front to I think what's hard to do is to make resource allocations on a one-off basis, right? When it's like, okay, do we go forward with this concept? What's a much better practice is to have a set of options in front of you and then decide, well, which of these do we decide to do, right? Because then you're making comparative trade-offs. And then you can start looking at like your risk versus reward scale and everything. And so I think it's just important that you have some type of established resource planning mechanism within an organization versus it being on a one-off basis and a haphazard basis. And the other version of that is a very programmatic basis where it essentially just gets peanut buttered across the organization, and it doesn't allow for real big endeavors to take place or for experimentation to take place. There's lots of ways that basically the entire system is rigged for incremental improvement. And that's what you kind of see in kind of chasing the low hanging fruit is like, that's all that the systems dynamics allow for. And it is a systems dynamics challenge of how to adjust how companies get this done. You can't approach it from just like, oh, we need a resource allocation process, or we need an experimentation process, or we need to talk about a different leadership model, or we need to change our metrics. You need to think through all those factors because it is a systems dynamic situation.
Yeah, and I would actually push back on the premise of the question, namely that your customers need persuading to come along with you on these small bets. I think your customers have pain points. They want you to innovate. They want you to do something new for them. Every customer has pain points, like, and sometimes, it's you have to dig a little bit deeper. Like, I'm sure that when Amazon got to the point of doing reviews or AWS, it was not that, intuitive that that was what the customer wanted, but because Amazon knew their customer maybe better than the customer knew themselves, they said, like, hey, this is something they're going to really love. And when we put it in front of them, they're not going to need any persuasion. They're gonna tear down the door to get to this thing.
One of the, I think, really important mindsets today is especially in complex products and services is co-innovation, right? You have to include your ecosystems, your distributors, your vendors, and key customers throughout the process of new idea development and testing. And I think the more you adopt, you kind of lower the legal thresholds. That's the big thing that gets in the way here, and adopt a co-innovation mindset and model. Then you really lower the risk, and you get inherent early customer adoption and feedback, and that feedback is early in the process.
Spot on. And also tying back to something you said earlier, John, about companies also needing a process for innovation. They don't have a process. I've been surprised. I was at a startup, a high tech startup, and this was kind of par for the course. This is what we did. We did sprints all the time. We talked to customers. We put prototypes in front of customers really, really fast. And when I got into the consulting world and I tried to do that with my clients, I thought that was kind of obvious and everybody did that. But I found out really quick, like, that's not the case. Like, a lot of companies still have this very long, drawn out product development process, and they're not getting enough feedback. They're waiting forever to put something in front of the customer because they want it to be perfect. But maybe talk a little bit more about that, because I was very surprised to see how far behind a lot of companies are on the process and the agile frameworks that they need to build.
The simplest easy point I can make on that is I get to talk to a lot of teams and audiences about this very stuff, and I'll oftentimes ask, like, so raise your hand if you think that innovation is critical to your company's success over the next 5 to 7 years, right? 95% of the audience will raise their hand. Yes, I agree with that. And then you ask the question, who here has an actual process for how ideas get vetted, resourced, how you experiment, how you decide to prune or scale, like a real innovation process? Rarely does anybody raise their hand, right? And so it's that essential disconnect that we all say, we all know that it's we have to do this, but yet we don't develop a deliberate system or approach for it. I think that's the great mismatch that faces most big companies today, is that inherent mismatch. And that's the my mission, and the work I like to do is helping to connect those two observations together. Like, we have to approach the systems dynamics problem of how do we create a playbook within the company that allows for new idea exploration.
I think that's spot on. And the analogy that comes to mind is like, hey, everybody probably wants to get fit, but not everybody is so healthy. Why? They probably don't have a good system in place to get fit, right? Like, everybody wants to be in shape, but there are a lot of people that aren't. Why is that? And when you ask the folks that maybe are not reaching their goal, you say, hey, what's your schedule? How are you prioritizing these things? Do you have like a membership? Do you have buddies that keep you in line? Do you have hobbies that do that? And it's like, no, 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 no. Well, like, if you're just relying on your motivation to be fit, that's never going to work.
Especially if you don't have a history of doing that, right? And so when you're building a new habit, what do you have to do when you're building a new habit? You have to be very conscious of it. You have to be really deliberate about it. And you need reminders. You need a coach. You need exemplars. You need to be slightly inefficient about it, right? Like, you're not going to be a star day one at this practice, you know that it's going to take some time and everything, right? But people don't think about that. Like, oh, like we are essentially building a new skill set here, and it's going to take some time, and it's like building a new habit, and everything. So it's just fascinating to me that people don't recognize that what it takes to create real change within a company on these types of topics.
Yeah, absolutely. In my practice, we leverage a sprint framework, so we're doing 2 to 4 week sprints. I like that. Eventually, sometimes it takes a little bit of some work to get companies up to speed. That will go at that pace, but I like it because you can measure it. You can see, how much progress do we make in this 4 week sprint. How is that different than the progress that we made 3 months ago when we were just starting this thing? Oh, now we have a prototype up and running. We have this data streams that are kicking in. We didn't have that 4 weeks ago. That means that we've gotten better. We've
Right.
gotten better at moving fast and producing products and showing it to customers and getting feedback, learning from that and getting ready for the next sprint. And you can measure that. You can measure that progress over time. So you don't
And
have
and
to.
and it creates a sense of urgency and a can do, must do mindset.
Yes, yes, absolutely. John, Amazon is famous for metrics. Like I think in your book you wrote about them having 500 metrics in place. You've also talked about the fact that they need to be as granular as possible and as real time as possible. I'm wondering if you could talk more about that because I think that is spot on. And now with new IoT devices and more connectivity and more storage, it's possible to be very real time and to be much more granular than you could have been in the past.
Yeah, so I was at Amazon from early 2002 through late 2005. I got to launch the marketplace business at Amazon, and I thought I knew how to measure things well and evaluate and take action on them. And I completely learned a whole new level of how to use metrics as the focal lever to create insights and create accountability and create change, right? And so the whole we would spend more time debating what were the right metrics for a new product, a new service, a new capability, a new geography. We would spend more time defining what the metrics were and how to think about kind of adoption, cost, quality, speed, all of those types of categories of metrics. We'd spend more time debating those as we would as like what the actual use case or features or whatnot would be, because we knew coming out of the sprint, hey, the product's not going to be perfect, but if we had our metrics right, then teams we're going to have an attentive eye to like, okay, how do we increment past it? How do we keep driving improvement? And the whole mindset is, you're never done with your metrics. You're always adding new metrics, but you do have to design them, right? You have to think about how do you create your top level metrics and your ability to scan across there. And then if you see a deviation or a negative result, then the ability to quickly dive down into the deeper metrics that help give you an understanding of the true root cause and the true system dynamics of the situation. And then your whole week is engineered around revolving metrics meetings where people are getting together to debate these metrics. You're expected to understand what's going on in your service and your product and your capability. And it's a meeting of accountability and action. Like, so why did this happen and what are we doing about it? And so you need to make metrics a verb. It's all about taking action out of these metrics and not just having them as a way to essentially pat yourself on the back and saying, yeah, we're doing a great job. You need to, it's a real different mindset to, essentially feature the bad news, right? Like you want to find the problems. The problems are where the opportunities are at, not in the stuff that's going great. So feature the problem needs to be the mindset. And when leaders demonstrate that and that they are self-critical and that they will feature their own problems, that creates the opening then for everybody else just like, yep, let's focus on the problems, which are our opportunities for improvement.
Yeah, I really like that as well. I think you got to get the metrics right, in part because they're the scoreboard for everybody. And when you have a way for determining what success looks like, then you give people autonomy and free range to do whatever it takes to get that metric up. So if you got to get a ball in a basket, that's how you're going to score points. Okay, you can shoot, you can drive, you can pass, you can do what you have to do, but just get the ball in the basket. That's 2 points, that's 3 points, and everybody is aligned on that.
That's right.
What are some of the challenges that companies have with metrics? Because I think a lot of companies try to put in metrics, and some of them might think that they're doing it right. But I guess in your experience, what's some of the things that you have to work with companies on?
Well, first is around, I'd say, accountability. Try as much as possible that a person owns a metric. And that doesn't mean that they own all the organization or product or whatever it is that is defined by that metric. It just means we're asking that person to be the owner for that metric. And that person is going to go anywhere in the organization they need to go in order to hit the target, understand the deviations, understand the problems of the errors. One of the big things you're trying to always compensate for is your organization structure, right? Like you don't want an organization structure is helpful to help build reporting lines and jobs and general capabilities, but organization structures get in the way of actually driving, you know, horizontal products and horizontal challenges, right? And so metrics are a good way, a good compensating way of allowing a problem that oftentimes goes across the organization to pursue the real truth of the issue, right? The real root cause of what's going on. So if you can assign an owner to a metric and make sure everybody knows, like, hey, when somebody's coming to talk to me about their metric, like, it doesn't matter what the org chart says or whatever, like we're working an issue. I report to that person relative to this topic and everything, right? We're mission driven versus organizationally driven. So that's one thing that companies don't do well. And they engineer their metrics so that they're mostly green, right? And so when your metrics are mostly green, you're not learning. And so you need to redesign your metrics. So, sometimes that means like, hey, we go to just the tail of the metric and really focus in on where we're not hitting a certain expectation. Sometimes it means we're just measuring the wrong thing, like we're not measuring the true customer experience or whatever it is. And so if all your metrics are green, you're actually not learning very much. And so you really need to start questioning, where are the imperfections, where are customer frustrations. Listen to your field team, listen to your customer contact center, and where there is a disconnect between what customers are saying about what's going on versus what your metrics are, trust what your customers are saying. Always trust what your customers are saying. And it typically means your metrics aren't actually helpful in that circumstance. So that's a couple of things that companies get wrong on metrics.
Ownership, make sure that some of them are red from time to time. You might not be measuring the right thing if they're all green, and then look for discrepancies where the customer experience
Doesn't match your
contradicts the
metrics.
matches.
Yep.
That's like a telltale sign, like, oh, you gotta dig deeper into this. I really like that. John, we're actually a little over time. Tell us where we can follow you, where your thought leadership. Where can we get access to that?
So best place is my Substack newsletter. So it's the Digital Leader newsletter. You can find it on Substack. It's free, so please sign up. It's a weekly-ish newsletter about innovating and creating change. And the Amazon way is at Amazon and Kindle, paperback, and Audible. And you can find me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. All right. And I will include links to John's LinkedIn profile and his newsletter in the show notes. So look out for those notes that should come out shortly. John, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. I really enjoyed it. And I'm sure our audience learned a heck of a lot. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Manny, you rock. Thanks for the conversation.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.